My name is Paul Riddle. I'm a Director of Spiritual Care for Lifeline Chaplaincy in Houston, and I'm sort of serving as host for today's meeting. And we have our presenter is Gabe Fisher, and I'll turn it over to Gabe in a minute. You can introduce yourself, Gabe, tell the group anything you want them to know about you. And uh, Gabe is my colleague with Lifeline. He is Director of Spiritual Care for Lifeline Chaplaincy in Dallas. And so he does there what I do for Lifeline in Houston. And we're delighted to have all of you with us. We may have other people joining the meeting as we begin. Before we get started, I would like to put in a plug for these lunch and learn sessions. We will be doing these the first Thursday of every quarter. So the next lunch and learn will be in January, right after the first of the year. And we're the moment we're building the schedule for 2024. If you would like to present in January or in one of the other quarterly lunch and learn sessions, let me know. I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. Okay, so I just put my contact information in the chat. Um, that's all of the introductory material that I have. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Gabe, and we're in your hands.
Thank you very much. It is good to see you all this afternoon, or to see some names. I see at least a few names that I recognize. That's a pleasant surprise. Like Paul mentioned, just offering a little bit more background on myself. I have served in church ministry, in bivocational roles, various teaching ministries. I was in hospice as a chaplain and bereavement coordinator. Part of my bivocational journey was going through culinary school, working in various capacities in that industry, connecting that into ministry. Before my current position, I was there at a nonprofit. I noticed a name there I recognize who's connected to that organization as well. Served some time there. As I mentioned, I moved over to Dallas to work here with Lifeline Chaplaincy as their director of spiritual care about a year ago. So we've been a little bit more than a year that we've been over in this area and settling in, working with the hospitals and working with the churches. I've been married for 12 years now. We have 3 children. My wife works as a speech pathologist. She works in geriatrics and currently now in pediatrics. We have a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 3-year-old, which is kind of hard to believe at this point. Pastoral care has been a pretty important part of my life. Going back 10 years ago is when I was first immersed into it. During my MDiv, I did my field education at the local hospital. And during that internship, it was like my eyes were opened. And it was this moment of, wow, I didn't realize ministry could look this way. I didn't realize that this was available. And so I stayed with them on PRN for about a year and a half after that internship, and something just clicked in those early experiences. I didn't have time to follow up on it or an opportunity until hospice came around, but I focused on pastoral care in my master's degree, in my doctoral studies. I get to write about it on the Mosaic blog. And one of the blessings of working with Lifeline Chaplaincy has been the chance to continue that education. I'm on my 3rd unit of clinical pastoral education. at Baylor University Medical Center. I work on the trauma floors over there. I'm slowly working my way through that wonderful board certification process and making little steps here and there in the competencies. So it's been a big part of my life with training, with ministry focus, but also on the personal side as well. My wife's granddad began to end his journey with cancer. And at that time, he went on to hospice as well with my team. And so coworkers then became caregivers for us. And we were on the receiving end of pastoral care and wonderful nurses and CNAs who made a world of a difference. And my grandma being on hospice as well, and the team coming in and caring for her. So pastoral care is also just a very personal thing for my life. I'm excited to share a little bit about it with you today. From this perspective, I'm going to pull up my screen. So excuse me as I pause briefly. All right. Well, this presentation it represents the work that was initiated by my hospice experiences. It found some expression in my doctoral thesis, and then it became a paper that I published through the Journal on Discernment. So I've had an ongoing relationship with it for a little over 4 years now. It's gone through many revisions along the way as I interact with experiences and get insights from wonderful people who have spoken into it. We'll be focusing on the integration and the application of practical theology with pastoral care in multiple settings. And the way I have it set out is I'll work through the material, but there'll be a couple of times where we'll take a little sidestep and maybe just a 60-minute quick reflection that we can throw in the chat, or if somebody wants to unmute and offer some feedback, I'd appreciate that as well. But that'll be built in throughout with these moments of reflection. So giving you a heads up for that. So where are we going with it? We're going to offer some context to how this practical theology created space developed. We'll take a balcony view of this practical theology, so to speak. I'll name some of the conflicting views or some of the challenges to it. Every perspective has challenges, and so I don't pretend that this is an airtight one. There is room to grow. I'll share some of the insights that have come about from my work with it, and then some possible applications moving forward. But to get us into this, I mentioned those 60-second times of reflection. I want to encourage you, if you have a notepad or a phone app, you may be driving, so you may not have an opportunity to, but I want you to just take 60 seconds to write down as many things as you can revolving around two of these questions. And we'll take 60 seconds on each of them, then we'll come back and we'll talk about it to get into this. So the first question, very simple. What do you find most motivating about your current place of pastoral practice? So just kind of thinking about where you serve right now. If you can take 60 seconds, just get down as many things as you can and either put that in the chat or bring it to the group by unmuting. Thank you, Paul. I see that. Anyone else? Just a few more seconds. Okay, this leads into the next question. We're getting two here to kind of get our minds going here in the beginning of the afternoon. See if it'll show up for me here. So what key values are guiding your pastoral care? See if you can name as many as you can. That could be just a one word to capture that value. But as you think about the practice you get to be a part of, think about the organizations you're a part of, just your daily pastoral care. What values do you see undergirding those? And see if you can get as many of those down as possible. We'll take 60 seconds for this one. That's a big one for me. Thank you, Paul. I see respect in the chat. Compassion. Oh, being a part of an interdisciplinary team, multidisciplinary team, a valued member providing care. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, dignity. Oh, I like that. Hospitality. That's a big one. Okay. Thank you all very much. I'd like to invite you to, Imago Day. Thank you, Chris. And it's good to see your name on there. Okay. I want us to keep those answers in the back of our minds. Part of the challenge of practical theology and pastoral theology specifically is that we're not taking formal articulations and then, placing them on life. Rather, we're looking around and we're beginning a conversation with experience. So in this sense, we're constantly trying to get at what's driving our pastoral care, what's really motivating and guiding and directing the care that we offer to our patients, to our families, to the staff members, to coworkers. What's really behind that? So it's this ongoing process, this ongoing loop of reflection. And if you think about that exercise, we might be able to summarize it with this kind of question: is my espoused theology congruent with my lived theology? Or in other words, is what I believe the same, what I say I believe, is that the same as what I actually believe in practice? We can come up with a lot of great definitions and formulations, but when it comes down to actually walking into a room or standing beside a coworker, what actually comes out? What am I actually believing here? So we'll keep these things in mind as we move through this presentation. Some of the initial context for this and some of the insights behind this is I was working as a hospice chaplain during my doctoral studies, and that gave me three unique perspectives or characteristics for that context. It was a place of a very close interdisciplinary team. Tom mentioned this. I see Eric on there. You can relate to this. Very regular meetings, coming together to share reports on every individual patient. The chaplain in that organization had a role in offering reports as well, very similar to a huddle in a hospital setting, getting to be a part of that daily care office space that is shared, so you see each other and just daily comings and goings, going on visits with nurses, being present at time of death, doing interventions with social workers. All of this just intermingled together. So that was the first unique characteristic of this ministry. The second one is a palliative care context, which means extended patient relationships. Sometimes we get this in the hospital, especially when you go into oncology and places like this. But oftentimes we have patients who are only in the hospital for 3 or 4 days and then they're discharged. Or if we're within a unit or within an office setting, we may develop longer extended relationships with our coworkers. But that was the second contribution. The third was it was a setting of acute spiritual care situations, new diagnosis, end of life, grief, and deaths. And so there was this sense of immediacy within that setting. So these opportunities gave me four insights that began to spur some of the work in this paper. One of those was spiritual care was naturally occurring outside of my role as a chaplain. I had a big role in it, but it was naturally occurring already. The second was spiritual care was an interdisciplinary concern. We were all brushing up against it in some way. We were all interacting with it as questions naturally surfaced in conversations. Three, we can all, I think, relate to this. There was some clarity in terms of what does a chaplain do? What is a chaplain? What role do they play? What things do I bring to them? Even within people who had worked with chaplains for years, there's kind of this mystery section of what goes on when a chaplain goes into the room with a patient. And so there was this potential gap in practice. Where do we go from there? I saw that we were living in this tension between scope of practice and best practices. So on the one hand, chaplains are experts in spiritual care. We've heard this mantra many times. This is our role on their interdisciplinary team. We are the experts of spiritual care. But on the other hand, spiritual care was naturally being offered by nurses, CNAs, volunteers, even family members and friends who are part of the situation. You can frame that not just in chaplaincy, but in ministry as well. You have the congregational minister who is in a lot of ways a specialist. They're the ones who are preaching, who are leading classes, who are leading different programs in the church. And yet, ministry is happening among the lay members also, and oftentimes driven by lay members also. So chaplains are turned to matters of spiritual need, of distress and concerns. However, patients often turn to people in other disciplines with those matters also, especially in contexts where the relationships have become established. And maybe the trust is with somebody else on the team. And so I became curious. I began to ask questions like, could there be a way to provide some kind of accessible interdisciplinary training in pastoral care? How could I better articulate the theological component of what chaplains bring to the table? What would pastoral care look like if it was informed by the interdisciplinary experiences I knew were there? So the knowledge that was already a part of the organization, we're going to call that idiographic knowledge. What if my pastoral care was informed by what they brought to the table? And so moving forward, I wanted to explore, a theocentric grounding for what I was doing. What do chaplains bring to the table in terms of our theology and that specialized training that we have? And I wanted to develop an approach that was contextualized. It was organically working within our specific setting. And in these insights, these questions, and these curiosities, I found a great conversation partner in practical theology. That's what led me in this direction. Practical theology naturally emerged from the wrestling that I was doing at that time. And it helped me navigate some of these kinds of questions. So some basic premise for this work. One is that the efficacy of spiritual care increases when it's approached as an interdisciplinary concern. We could say the same thing with a congregation. The ministry that we're able to do in a congregation increases when it is the full concern of the congregation. And then spiritual care deepens when it integrates the idiographic knowledge found within an organization. So what is surfacing from those individual experiences, from the individual practices, from the perspectives that come within that unique organization. It doesn't dilute, it strengthens. So these are some of the working assumptions that I have. And it may mean a shift in mindset, to be honest. Instead of the chaplain or the minister just introducing spiritual care into the system, the chaplain also listens to the spiritual care already inherent in the organization. So it's a both and approach, listening to what is being offered by other members of the organization. Okay, here's another 60-second step away for reflection. I want you to think about this question. If you could describe the culture of spiritual care in your organization where you serve, how would you describe it in a couple of sentences? Let's take 60 seconds for that. If you could describe the culture of your organization for spiritual care, how would you do it in a couple of sentences? Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, mission oriented, no fail mentality, highly structured military. Thank you. Okay, I'll pause. I encourage you to find some time, if you're still thinking about it in your own time, to readdress that question. Oh, I have a fulfilling integrated, fulfilling integrated in the IDT towards human dignity and respect motivating from a theological understanding. Oh, that's good. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I love the human dignity component of that. So I'd encourage you all just to dig into that a little bit. How would you describe the culture of spiritual care in your organization? Um, Paul mentions the teaching and research hospitals. That's a very different culture, diverse. Thank you for bringing that up. Some of our contexts are not as diverse as others. That's a huge component of it. Thank you all. Yeah, I encourage you to spend some time on that. So moving forward, I want to use kind of a balcony metaphor to explain things. What that means is we get up on the balcony and we look down at all the different components so that we can see all the pieces laid out on the table, so to speak. And then we'll walk back down the stairs for a closer look. So we'll begin with the balcony approach. Over here. So instead of reinventing the wheel, I wanted to share the abstract from this paper because it gives us that larger perspective. It says this is a practical theology of created space that attends to the questions raised by critical incidents and context by cultivating dialogue among experiences, beliefs, perceptions, and theology. This confessional approach works from the conviction that God is active and present within our experiences, and that we are called to participate in the compassionate ministry of Christ. A created space represents a holding pattern of listening and dialogue where attention is given to the other person's experiences, beliefs, present concerns, and our own formed center using the resources of spiritual theology. So there's a lot there. I want to break it down a little bit. The first thing I want to focus on is this phrase, critical incidents. So I'm narrowing the context of ministry to critical incidents here. I know that pastoral care happens in all kinds of settings. We're focusing on this. I mean by this, discernible encounters that often make up pastoral care. It can be a conversation, a trauma event, a death, a bereavement journey. So it can stretch beyond a single conversation, but the boundaries are still definable as an event. There's still some kind of crisis or loss that has happened. And within that event, we can focus on a number of different things. We can think about practices, beliefs, values, grief, emotions, all these different things that occur within that. Pastoral care often happens in this kind of encounter. That's why we narrow it down. And I mention that because at the time I was brushing up against this idea or this attitude that viewed pastoral care as more of a detour to the real stuff of ministry and the real stuff of theology. This is something that you do when something comes up and you get back to the real work. But what I believe is that pastoral events really are rich ground for theological reflection, for praxis. They're rich ground for ministry, for care, for compassion. And so in a lot of ways, pastoral care is where theology becomes operative. It's where all those really clean, nice cut definitions get put to the test to see if they can actually hold up any weight in real life. So I think we bring a lot to the table when we're thinking about pastoral care. The second thing I want to highlight is that this is a confessional approach. It's grounded in faith. It's grounded in faith traditions, which provide tools for both assessment and for practice. And so it kind of views this goal of objective neutrality that sometimes gets passed around a bit as kind of being unhelpful. We all have bias that we can't avoid. And so instead, it honors the importance of our theological commitments. and naming those commitments, the importance of being able to put those on the table and say, this is what drives me, this is what guides me, this is what gives it focus. And so, in a lot of sense, there's that integrity and that honesty that comes with that approach. And then finally, I want to draw our attention to this phrase I use called the formed center. This is more of a term for convenience, for organization. It refers to all of that inward stuff that we bring to the table. So it includes our life experiences, our beliefs and theologies, our values, cultures, practices, personality traits, all those things that are inside us that we bring into it. And it's not just bias, it's not to be viewed negatively, but it's also a resource, this deep perspective that we bring, these gifts that we walk in with us. So the form center represents the total sum of our presence. This is a visual depiction of what we mean by this. Ron Bruner helped me with this illustration. I think it really well captures what we're trying to say in that abstract. We can see that life is interrupted by that critical incident. So this could be a motor vehicle collision, a new diagnosis, a divorce, spiritual distress, a gunshot wound, or just a pastoral conversation. That's what we mean by critical incident. It interrupts life. And then everyone in that event is bringing their formed center with them. The created space is the suspended judgment that we talked about earlier. We'll get to that more in depth when we talk about the presence of God. But the working assumption is that the good use of that creative space leads to the possibility, or at least the invitation of new perspectives emerging on both sides. So it's just kind of a quick visual snapshot of what we're talking about. We've given the visualization of created space. I want to talk a little bit more about where we're pulling from, what sources we're diving into. Let's take another quick 60-second reflection. We're going to do this all the way throughout. I want you to think about the sources that you're using in the work that you do. This could be psychology, sociology, theology, scripture, any of these things that we pull from. I want you to think about the past month in particular. Let's think about September. Did you notice yourself relying more on a particular model, discipline, or theory? Was there one that kind of rose to the surface for you? And can you name that? What are you functioning out of right now? Let's take 60 seconds and think about that. Hey, did anybody come up with any insights, anything you might want to put in the chat or share with the group? Story, listening, and prayer. Thank you, Tom. Presence. Wounded healer. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I love Henry Nouwen's contribution. I still find that so convicting. Biblical narratives as pattern for current living. Great. Systems theory, trauma informed. Yeah, I love systems theory. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I think we hope that we bring a balanced approach. I think inevitably we kind of tend to lean towards one or the other. in our practice. And probably as we grow, we switch through some of these. I see Rogerian theory of reflective listening, empathy, acceptance with non-judgment. Thank you, Chris. So as I mentioned earlier, this is something that I'm trying to develop as a theocentric approach to pastoral care. And it's not trying to discount any of the other disciplines, the psychology, the sociology. I use several of them myself and find them very helpful. And I think we're supposed to actually. What I was wanting to explore was this theological dimension of our practice, because I believe we do have something unique to offer as chaplains, as ministers, something to contribute. And so the larger framework that I'm working out of, can't get this thing to click for me. The larger framework we're working out of is practical theology. The mechanism is spiritual theology within that. So we're building this model that I'm talking about. And what do we mean by those? A considerable amount of time has been given to definition. Practical theology has kind of a complex history. And even people who write about it saying that it doesn't, they kind of demonstrate that it does by having to write about it. There's not a lot of agreement sometimes on some of the components of practical theology. For example, what's the proper location? Where does it belong? Is it something with the academy? Is it more of a grassroots thing? Is it within the church? Is it in the hospitals? Where does it belong? That's one question. Another question is, where do we focus? Are we supposed to be talking about practices, experiences, beliefs? What is the focus of practical theology? And then there's this internal debate on where we're supposed to start when we actually begin to reflect, when we begin to ask questions, when we begin to consider sources. So one side leans heavily toward beginning with experience, while the other leans heavily toward beginning with theological commitments, revelation, scripture, these things some people will call divine activity, that side of things. So how we answer those considerations informs the kinds of questions we ask in our ministry, the way that we explore them, and what our overall goals are as well. And so here's my definition for practical theology. I'll offer some concessions to this internal tension. And we can't avoid our experience in a situation, and we shouldn't. However, we also believe that God is an active agent, often already involved in a situation. So there's this unavoidable place for both, for God's activity and for experience. We're making room for both of those things. So stepping into that complicated ring, here's my definition for practical theology. So practical theology is the task of understanding and participating in the ministry of God by bringing the diversity of experience into conversation with theological sources, spirituality, and our own formed center. So each phrase in that definition has a place, a very specific place. The phrase task shows that we're continually engaging God and life theologically. This is what we do in our work. We're just constantly reflecting and thinking about God and life. Understanding and participating are placeholders for spiritual theology. I'm leaning on contemplative and incarnational spiritual theologies. I'll explain what that means in a little bit. That's the how. That's the mechanism, how we're actually getting at doing what we're doing. And then conversation tries to remove that unhelpful dichotomy between divine activity on one side and human experience on the other. But we're really trying to pay attention to both. They both have a place at the table. Human experience raises the need for reflection, and reflection naturally emerges from pre-existing theological commitments. It's a both-and approach. So in pastoral care, we pay careful attention to both personal experience and divine activity. So that's our approach, bringing all those elements into reflective conversation. I want to talk about spiritual theologies, what we mean by that. So spiritual theology is concerned with the growth and formation of a person. I'm going to put that up on the slide if you want to read it. That's a more technical definition for it, but when it comes down to it, it's growth and formation of a person. It answers how someone progresses in their faith and toward what goal. So it's faith formation. It provides some structure to how we engage spirituality. So in this approach, spiritual theologies are the mechanism we use to help create space and room for dialogue. In a practical theology of created space, I'm relying on two. So I mentioned the contemplative spirituality and the incarnational spirituality. And I believe that in both of those, they give us a posture for approaching pastoral situations. In my paper, I go more in depth into the biblical texts behind these. For our time this afternoon, I'm just giving us the summary statements. But on the contemplative posture, it's a lot like a tree by streams of water. It's putting down roots toward that source of water. I'm thinking of the imagery of Psalm 1 or Jeremiah 17, looking for those deeper sources of meaning in life, finding that connection with God. It's about an attentiveness to God's presence, to self, and to others, this commitment to being still, to being quiet enough to pay attention to what's going on in God, in ourself, and in others. And it's a loving response to God's activity. We are very much a productivity-based culture of constantly moving on to the next goal. And this posture reminds us that a lot of what we do is a response to what God has already done. This is 1 John 4:19. We're responding to God in this sense. It's a growing sense of wonder, a wonder of what God has created, who God has created, where God is present, and who God is. This is Psalm 19 and Psalm 104. Not get this thing to move for me. And then it's a growing sense of humility in what we know, understanding that with all our training, with all our perspective, there's still things that we might miss. And so being curious, trying to listen deeply to what is in front of us. That's the contemplative posture in pastoral care. On the incarnational side, this flows out of the contemplative. They're not disconnected, but they really are deeply intertwined. And we think about biblical narrative. I think it might have been Chris who mentioned that, where you have Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days in the presence of God, facing this temptation, these trials, and then coming out of that into his compassionate ministry. They flow out of each other. So the incarnational posture is following this invitation of Jesus's narrative. It's acknowledging God's presence in the situation. This is Matthew 1, Matthew 28. It's making room for the place of suffering. This is John 19 at the foot of the cross, not being able to fix or redeem, but just sitting with somebody's pain. And it's this answer to a call to compassion. And this is the connection between Luke 4 and Acts 1. So these are the postures that we bring with us into pastoral care. Both of those spiritual theologies give us the proper posture for exploring creative space, but they also give us some specific guiding values. Part of this comes from the reflection we have in Scripture. Part of this in the paper also came from just working with my interdisciplinary team, getting their perspectives on the care they're giving to patients, getting their experiences in the times that they did brush up against spiritual care. And out of all that reflection came these three guiding values. We mentioned it at the beginning. What values are guiding you? And so three surfaced: curiosity, patience, and welcome. I might call these guideposts for pastoral care. First of all, curiosity. Anything can derail a pastoral encounter. I think we've all experienced this. It could be our emotional capacity at the time, or the person that we're talking to, whether they're able to engage. It could be the theological perceptions. We're just missing each other in this conversation. Maybe we have very much opposing values and views. Whatever it is, there are so many things that could derail it. And so a reflexive gauge is simply to ask, to what extent am I willing to grow in a new perspective? When I walk into this crisis situation or into this conversation, how willing am I to actually grow and to change myself? So we begin with curiosity. And next with patience. The contemplative posture helps adjust our expectations of immediacy. I recognize that dialogue is kind of a word that's just thrown around a lot, and I think it's romanticized in some ways. But dialogue is not a quick fix, and dialogue doesn't always work. Sometimes we end the conversation and nothing has been accomplished, or we're told to leave the room, or a wall is thrown up and we don't move farther than that wall. We've all experienced this. And so patience helps readjust our expectations. Entering created space means holding our expectations lightly. And then the third value being welcome. The incarnational posture teaches us about this value. And this is a commitment to the well-being of the person sitting in the room with us. We view them as if they were Christ themselves. This is Matthew 25. Especially when we begin to feel those things inside of us that are resistant. Maybe they represent something that is particularly harmful in our past narrative. Maybe they represent someone who hurt us or our loved ones. Maybe their views are just completely opposite of our own. Whatever it is, we feel those things bubbling up. This maintains this commitment to view them as if they were Christ in the room. We welcome others as Christ welcomed us. That's Romans 15. And so the value allows us to provide compassionate care in the face of all kinds of socioeconomic, cultural, theological, psychological, all the different health concerns that come in pastoral care. And so my hope at this point, we're kind of breezing through this, is to show how this practical theology builds. Practical theology gives us the framework. Spiritual theology gives us the mechanism for engagement. It gives us the posture of walking into these situations. And then out of all of this emerges these three guiding values. So let me pause here. We have time for one more breakaway, a 60-second reflection. I want you to ask this question to yourself. What are the goals of your current pastoral care? If you could write that down in a sentence or two, what are your current goals for the ministry you're a part of? Let's take 60 seconds. Thank you. To address the unique spiritual issues and challenges of military members and veterans. That's a wonderful ministry. Thank you for that. Support the patient as they do the spiritual work of coping with their illness, loss, and situation. Help the patient and family find a sense of peace, if possible. Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Thank you all. So when I talk about practical theology of created space, I envision 4 goals. I see another one: to develop community that fosters growth and shelter to airmen and families. Oh, I like that word, shelter. Thank you. So I envision 4 goals for the work that I'm doing. It's a better grasp of where and how God is at work, a clearer awareness of our own convictions and perspectives, more accurate understanding of the critical incident and details, and a better way forward. So we've given the framework, and we've talked about the theory, the values, the goals. I want to offer and try to substantiate it a little bit by offering a model to concretize it in our minds. In my paper, I chose to use Richard Osmore's 4 tasks for pastoral engagement. We're probably familiar with it. I'm referring to it as the 4 questions model. I like his model because it's really adaptable to multiple theological frameworks. I also like that it's coming out of the world of practical theology. And many of the models that we use for assessment, as wonderful as they are, they have a history outside of our discipline. The FICA and things like this coming out of physician assessments that are then adapted for chaplain use. But I like that Osmer is speaking the language of practical theology, and I like that it is adaptable. My rationale for using it in crisis is that we need something that's simple, that's accessible, and that's teachable. So we just kind of get to the point. So this model gives us four questions that we can ask in terms of assessment. What is going on? Why is it going on? What ought to be going on? And then what then should we do? We can maybe imagine where the potential holdups are. We put a lot of energy into ensuring that we don't push our beliefs on others. We don't guide them where they don't want to go. And our guiding theological values help us maintain those boundaries. The first question is probably the easier one for us to answer. This is the level of us gathering facts. The second question takes some curiosity. Why is this going on? We have to listen with nuance, be aware of our own formed centers so that we're not taking that lens and pushing our assumptions on other people. So curiosity, why is it going on? And then in our context, the third question is where we are listening for incongruence, for their form center, for their distress. All that requires patience. There's that value surfacing there. What ought to be going on? Not what I think should be going on, but what ought to be going on. What kind of congruence? Where are their beliefs at play here? And then that last question is approached with our value of welcome. This is where our pastoral skills and intuition come into play. What then should we do? How do we approach this person compassionately with a sense of welcome? So this is the model that we might use to approach this practical theology. I want to move a little bit quickly. I want to honor our time. There are some conflicting views to this. As I mentioned earlier, I don't pretend to think that this is an airtight approach. This is just a conversation starter. There are some challenges. There is still some polarization in practical theology. Not everyone agrees to the definition or to the starting point. More needs to be said about underpinning philosophy of science that might affect values, that might affect practice. For instance, social constructivism is very common, and even in pastoral care circles, very common. I operate more from an assumption of critical realism, and we often serve in contexts that are steeped in histories of positivism. So these differences can easily lead to misunderstandings, to miscommunications. We need to spend time surfacing how do we understand our world? What assumptions do we bring with us? And I sometimes sense some hesitancy to lean on theology. I think this probably comes from our history in pastoral care. In many ways, we search for a sense of legitimacy around other established disciplines. So we might lean more one way or the other. But I believe we do have something significant to bring here. Territorialism. I envision this being used by ministers, chaplains, anyone involved in pastoral care. I got to work with volunteers when I was in hospice. I get to work with many volunteers now in Lifeline chaplaincy. Some people respond negatively to that. One of the first responses I got was, what makes them qualified? How can they participate in pastoral care? I had a PRN chaplain get upset about the idea of volunteer chaplains. There's sometimes this uneasy, unspoken tension between ministers and chaplains and the roles that they both play. Even within chaplaincy, these levels of legitimacy based on credentials and certification can come into the conversation. And so I understand that there can be some uneasiness around who's providing pastoral care and who allows them to do so. And then finally, it's not a concluded conversation. I've redefined the names of the values since the time that I wrote the paper. I'm a big fan of simplicity, so I'm constantly working to get things a little bit more concise and less academic sounding. There's need for refinement to put this into practice. But through all this, some insights have emerged. One is this idea of integration. There is room to move this into other organizations, to make room for it in conversations. The pastoral image. I believe that we bring something to the table with practical theology. We have a lot of images that guide the work that we do. I would encourage us to consider practical theology as an image that we can take into our work. And then equipping. My hope is that we might find something helpful here to be able to equip others. I'm currently using it in two ways. I've integrated parts of this theological framework into the training that I offer our volunteers. I've also been exploring applications of the theological values. I'm designing a Bible class for college students and young professionals around curiosity and faith. And so I'm going to give us some time for some feedback if we would like that, and for Paul to direct us. We're coming into the home stretch. But that's just a real quick overview of this practical theology of created space, how it might work, how it might lead to further reflection for us. My hope is that this practical theology will provide an accessible and yet grounded approach to engaging various forms of crisis ministry. I want to thank you all so much for those side reflections, for your engagement there. I'm going to hand it over to Paul to close us up.
Well, thank you so much, Gabe. This has been a great session. Thanks to everyone for participating. Another reminder, our next Lunch and Learn session will be the first Thursday of January, and we are putting out a call for presenters. So if you have material that you would like to present that you think would be of interest to a group of chaplains, this is a good forum for doing that. So if you would please get in touch with me. I left my contact information in the chat, and I'm going to be sending a message to Renee later this afternoon to send out to the Siburt Institute Chaplains Fellowship contact list, a call for presenters. So this is really, we're in our first full year of operation as a chaplains fellowship, and the whole purpose of this is to create a space in which chaplains of the Churches of Christ and Stone Campbell movement can have fellowship with one another, can network, can have iron sharpening iron, can support one another in our common work. And so with that, if there are no other comments, we'll go ahead and close it out for today. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you in January.